Now, most people have seen this clip thousands of times.
Rabbit season!
Duck season.
Rabbit season!
Duck season.
Rabbit season!
Duck season.
And yet, what you are actually watching is one of the greatest hidden milestones in Hollywood history, a cinematic event that most people never realized even existed.
Rabbit.
Duck fire!
The rabbit season, duck season bit isn't just a great joke. It's the exact frame where Daffy Duck stopped being a chaos agent and became something quite different. A character who always loses, but some would argue loses beautifully every single time. In May of 1951, audiences didn't think they were watching a monumental shift in animation history. To them, it was just another funny cartoon. In fact, if you look at the trade reviews from that time, they didn't even mention Daffy by name. They just called him a crazy duck.
I'm not crazy. I just don't give a darn.
So they had no idea that they were witnessing a complete change in what the Looney Tunes were going to be from then on. We have the benefit of hindsight. They certainly didn't. I mean, take a look at the Roadrunner series. So director Chuck Jones and Michael Maltese, they created the short The Fast and the Furious. Just a fun little idea of a predator trying to catch some prey, and that was that. But it became so popular that it ended up becoming one of their most famous series. It wasn't a case of, hey, you know what, let's make a landmark thematic trilogy. No, it was just something that happened. You have to understand, when the crew were working on these cartoons at the time, this was just another job to them. They would have rocked up to work and said, okay, let's make another cartoon. What ideas do you have for me? And then they would go ahead and make it. Sometimes things will be a major success.
What's up, Doc?
Other times, things will just fall flat. Think of it as like studios making a whole bunch of television pilots. The whole trilogy actually happened because when Rabbit Fire was made, writer Michael Maltese actually had written way too many brilliant verbal routines and comedic escalations to fit in just one 7-minute cartoon. But even then, they made Rabbit Fire and they thought that was that, but it became a huge success that they ended up making more, and they did over the following 2 years. Now, before we go any further, for those who aren't aware of what this trilogy actually is, it was never given an official name, but a lot of animation historians just call it the Hunting Trilogy. The gags in each of these shorts are so interchangeable that casual fans might think there was only one cartoon. But there are actually 3 distinct shorts, all directed by Chuck Jones, all written by Michael Maltese. And they are Rabbit Fire, released in May 1951, Rabbit Seasoning, released in September 1952, and Duck, Rabbit Duck, released in October 1953. Different seasons, but they're the same woods, same arguments, same 3 characters, but as we'll see, not quite the same cartoon each time. But to understand why this team-up changed everything, we have to look at what these characters were before 1951. So Elmer Fudd had finally, by this point, shed his soft, bulbous, early 1940s look to become the definitive, short-tempered everyman who would always be hunting a rabbit. Although he was put in other situations at the time. In one short, he was out trying to take a photo of wildlife. In another short, he was just this mad scientist. In another short, he was just working for the railroad trying to survey where the railway tracks were going to go. But he was structurally the essential, gullible patsy. Oh, and for the record, at one stage, Elmer was also fat. Leon Schlesinger put him on a diet. And that whole egghead to Elmer continuity question, that's its own video. Not dealing with that here. Bugs Bunny, on the other hand, by this point was already established as the unflappable winner. But you have to remember, he was an accidental star too. Tex Avery didn't set out to make a global icon with the wild hair, it just happened. He just made the short, he thought it was a funny idea of this hunter trying to get this wisecracking rabbit, and that's it. But it ended up being so popular that there was a mandate for the other crews to actually make more shorts starring this rabbit, and by this point, Jones was really working on his version of the rabbit, and everything just blended together in this weird mix that ended up becoming one of the most timeless characters in history. And throughout the 40s, each director actually had their own distinct version of the rabbit. Avery had the unbridled, fast-talking disruptor. Bob Clampett had the wild, elastic showman who would actually start things. He would be the actual agitator. He wouldn't actually be on the defensive side. In one short, he just messed with Elmer Fudd, only because he thought he looked pretty stupid, and that's it. And you got the whole short based on that. You had Friz Freleng, you had like the cool theatrical winner, always fighting aggressive blockades like Yosemite Sam, which was created in 1945. Robert McKimson has slightly more childlike bugs who went on these self-contained adventures, like a trip to the Ozarks or even a trip to the racetrack. or even giving a very childish response that he's not worth that much at the postal service, so stuff like that. And Jones himself treated Bugs as a highly cerebral intellectual thinker who only engaged when completely provoked.
Of course, you know, this means war.
He was driven across all the units, yet he was seen as the same, not only by the audiences at the time, but even today. But then the big one, Daffy Duck. Now, casual fans do like to say that Chuck Jones and Michael Maltese invented the greedy, self-serving Daffy here. Well, yes and no.
That, sir, is an investigated fabrication.
It was actually Friz Freleng that planted that seed 11 years earlier in 1940's You Ought to Be in Pictures, where Daffy actively plots to ruin Porky Pig's career, and we'll get to him in just a moment, so he can be the star. But what Jones and Maltese did in the late 1940s, though, was strip away that manic screwball mechanics and replace them with this unmitigated ego, insecurity, and absolute cowardice. And you can see the gradual evolution in this so-called transitional Daffy in shorts like You Were Never Duck here, where you can see the greedy side of him wanting to win this massive prize, but then you can still see some of the wackier side as well.
Unconstitutional! It's... Brother, could I use 5,000 smackareenies?
It wasn't as though they decided, you know what, let's just make Daffy this greedy type character and that's that. No, that just came as a gradual thing. They were trying new ideas. And this evolution wasn't just a Daffy thing either. As we enter the 1950s, all the studios were slowly doing away with these really wild and crazy characters that populated the 1930s and up until around the mid to late 40s. Even Woody Woodpecker, that was one of the wildest characters of them all, and even he calmed down a fair bit to fit this new decade. Yes, he was a crazy character, but definitely not as crazy as he was in the beginning. UBA had come onto the scene with what some people dismiss as limited animation, but in reality it was planned animation. Fewer drawings, more deliberate. Jones and Maltese were already moving in that direction in their own shorts. They had proven that they could make people laugh with less drawings. But for Daffy, this psychological shift also opened up a whole new avenue. It led to him playing these so-called roles, acting as, say, an arrogant cowboy or a spaceman, essentially an actor who's really terrible at his job and yet somehow keeps on getting work. But to make these parodies work, Daffy needed a straight man. And this is where a massive shift took place at the studio. And that straight man had a name most people forget in this context: Porky Pig, the character who had spent a decade as Looney Tunes' biggest star after the failures of Buddy and Beans. But we all love Buddy, right? In any case, by the time the Hunting Trilogy arrived, Porky had already been quietly demoted to Daffy's sidekick. His last solo short, The Wearing of the Grin, had already come and gone. The handover was complete. This was now Bugs and Daffy's studio. So I've already mentioned the names Chuck Jones and Michael Maltese. Chuck Jones had made some really great shorts with writer Ted Pierce, who was one of the major writers at the time. And his writing actually helped Jones move away from the ultra cutesy shorts like the Sniffles shorts into something with a bit more impact. You have the writer Michael Maltese. He arrived at the studio in the late 30s, and ironically, he was actually in You Ought to Be in Pictures. He plays one of the studio guards, although there he's voiced by Mel Blanc. But Jones and Maltese were like the Lennon and McCartney of Termite Terrace, and Maltese ended up being the perfect counterweight for Jones. Because even after Maltese left Warner Brothers to work for Hanna-Barbera in 1958, Jones once again started to get into the more cutesy stuff. But at the time, Maltese was Jones's main writer. He actually grounded Jones and brought with him a sharp, cynical wit that actually balanced perfectly with what they were doing. And the studio certainly couldn't keep affording to pay for all that non-stop, fluid, bombastic animation similar to what Bob Clampett were doing. Jones and Maltese turned that financial constraint into an advantage. Jones ended up using strong, held layout poses and precise facial deadpan, and Maltese had wonderful wordplay and wonderful gag work, and each of those strengths complemented each other perfectly. So all of these elements, you had the character evolutions, you had the lowering of the budgets, you had the brilliant writing by Maltese, you also had Jones starting to direct now with more held poses. That all collided in May of 1951 with Rapid Fire. And this is a true landmark, because also, it is the very first dedicated team-up of Bugs and Daffy. Yes, this is the one. They didn't do anything earlier. So it took them a whole decade to reach that point. And before some of the more hardcore fans type in the comments, yes, Bugs had a tiny black and white punchline cameo at the end of Porky Pig's feet.
Don't work, do they?
Which, by the way, was his only appearance in a black and white short. But this is considered to be the first true short to team up also with Elmer as well. In the past, sure, you've had a Wild Hare where you've had Bugs and Elmer along with all the other subsequent shorts, but even beforehand, you had Daffy team up with Elmer a few times. So the characters certainly knew each other, they were just never together as a trio. And the short itself also was deliberately engineered as a spiritual remake of Wild Hare. If you watch the two shorts, it's essentially the same cartoon, just done with different director sensibilities. And by the way, Jones loved Avery. In fact, Avery used to be his boss. Back when Tex Avery actually joined the studio, Chuck Jones was one of his animators, along with Bob Clampett for that matter. But what we got with Rapid Fire was a wonderful back-to-basics move, and there really isn't much of a plot to speak of in any of the three. It was just an excuse to have a bit of fun with a very simple idea. But we also cannot talk about this short without talking about the absolute brilliance of the voice actors.
This license permits bearer to shoot a Hey, Bud, how do you spell fricasseeing?
So you got two of them. You've got the uncredited Arthur Q. Bryan. He was never credited during this time as Elmer Fudd.
Be very, very quiet. I'm hunting wabbits. It's wabbit season. Hunting we will go, hunting we will go. I-O the Mario, hunting we will go. I'm a wet-hot sportsman after wild game.
And he grounds lunacy here as the perfect everyman.
I'm sorry, fellas, but I'm a vegetarian. I just hunt for the sport of it.
He had been voicing Elmer for over a decade by this point, and he's just as funny here as he was in the beginning, right up until the end. And then you have Mel Blanc, who we often forget that he's basically talking to himself in those scenes. Granted, when he records, he would have recorded one character, all the lines, with someone else bouncing the other lines to him, and vice versa. But the brilliant thing here, it's not just doing two voices, of course, Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, but as actor Hank Azaria once pointed out, the genius part about Rapid Fire was that you got Mel Blanc, he's voicing Daffy Duck, impersonating Bugs Bunny, then Bugs Bunny impersonating Daffy Duck, and that's one of the most trickiest things a voice actor can do, taking their own character, impersonating another one of their own characters.
Yeah. What's up, Doc? Having any luck on those ducks? It's duck season, you know. Just a darn minute. Where do you get that duck season stuff?
And of course, the cherry on top is that the scene is funny anyway. For all the technical brilliance of that scene, hey, it's also funny. So Rapid Fire gets released, and it ended up being a massive hit. And they kept the formula going. I mentioned earlier on that Mark Maltese had so many gags that weren't used in Rapid Fire, so they just kept it going.
Let's run through that again. Okay. Would you like to shoot me now or wait till you get home?
Shoot him now. Shoot him now.
You keep out of this. He doesn't have to shoot you now. Ha! That's it! Hold it right there! Pronoun trouble.
But if you look at the shorts compared to Rapid Fire, the look just completely changes. And the reason for that is you've got Rapid Fire. It has traditional forest layouts by Philip Degard and Robert Griberick. But by this point, the final piece of the Chuck Jones puzzle, if you will, when it comes to his crew, is Maurice Noble. He finally arrives, and Rabbit Seasoning is one of the first few shorts he actually works on. And Noble brings with him this highly stylized, geometric, modern theatrical space. In fact, if you watch the three shorts back to back to back, you'll actually notice the evolution of Chuck Jones as a director when it comes to the way his shorts look. Now, what's interesting, though, is that you've got these three wonderful shorts, and you'd think that the Jones Maltese team would have done many more of these, but you'd be surprised to know they only made one more after this, which was Beanstalk Bunny. And you had a bit of a change there. So instead of Elmer being a hunter, he's playing a giant. So they put the entire Hunting Trilogy setting, but in a fairy tale one instead. What's significant about Beanstalk Bunny isn't that the setting changes, it's that the formula still works, which just tells you that the hunting premise was never really the point. Bugs and Daffy were. And that's perhaps why Jones and Maltese continued the formula without Elmer, because they didn't need him. But by this point, the template was set, and the other directors also took notice. So you had Freeling and McKimson, they started doing their own trio shorts. Freeling adapted to his new Daffy relatively quickly, and eventually in the 1960s he would preside over the meanest version of the Duck, one of which calls back to the Daffy Duck of 1940s You Ought to Be in Pictures. McKimson kept that wacky screwball Daffy just a bit longer before having to actually do the same thing as the other directors to keep things consistent. But as for the trio, that was it. While Freeling and McKimson made their own trio shorts, Jones Maltese, after Beanstalk Bunny, never made another one, but Jones himself would continue to make Bugs and Daffy duo shorts. At first he would do it with Mark Maltese, but then once Mark Maltese left the studio, he just kept doing it with other writers. In fact, he even started one just before he got fired from the studio. And whenever he came back to the characters decades later, like for the Carnival of the Animals, or the opening sequence of Gremlins 2, he just went straight to the exact same dynamic that was created in this Hunting Trilogy. So today we know exactly what a landmark this trilogy is. And the best way to actually experience this short, unlike those even experiencing it for the first time in the theatre or cinema, depending on what you call them in your part of the world, you definitely want to check out the Platinum Collection Blu-ray set, because on physical media you'll have the full, uncompressed, uncensored short, unlike the streaming versions which would have some compression on it. If you want to see Maurice Noble's colours truly pop in HD, that's definitely the set you'll need to get. Plus, there's also wonderful special features too. So the next time someone quotes Rabbit Season, Duck Season to you, you know that they aren't just quoting a funny cartoon, they're quoting the exact moment Warner Brothers Animation grew up. It was the exact moment the team up changed the entire DNA of the studio and perfected a group of characters that will, quite frankly, outlive us all.
Could you tell me what season it really is?
Why, certainly, my boy. It's baseball season.